Well, thank you all for joining us on today's webinar. This is a special edition of the National Civic League's monthly series of Promising Practices webinars. And today we're happy to be co-hosting with the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. And we'll be hearing from our presenters, Larry Schooler and Wendy Willis, here shortly. Just really briefly, I wanted to give everybody on the call a quick sort of 30-second blurb about what the National Civic League does. We are a 125-year-old nonprofit, and we advance civic engagement in the hopes of creating equitable and thriving communities. Our primary work happens with community assistance, awards and events, and research and publications. A few of the things that we're known for include our community assistance around strategic planning, engagement plans, and city charters. Our flagship program is the All-America City Awards, which is what I'm in charge of. We award 10 communities each year for exceptional civic engagement practices. And then we also have a Health Equity Award and this monthly webinar series. And then last but not least, we have a number of publications. We are known for the quarterly National Civic Review that just recently went online, so feel free to check that out. We also have a Promising Practices database, which is full of success stories from local communities using civic engagement to address local problems. And then last but not least, we have our Civic Index, which is a really great tool for communities to self-assess their civic engagement infrastructure. So that is very briefly what we're all about. And now I'm happy to hand it over to Kiva Hummel and our co-host in CDD. Kiva?
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Hey, everyone. It is great to be here with you. My name is Kiva Hummel. I am wearing two hats today. I am with the National Civic League as the Civic Engagement Program Director at the League. And I am also with the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation as NCDD's Communications Coordinator. The National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation is a hub and resource center of innovators and practitioners who bring people together across divides to tackle today's toughest challenges. We serve as a gathering place, resource center, news source, and facilitative leader for this incredible community. I want to do a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. I know I imagine that many of us have been on a lot of Zoom calls lately, but for those that haven't, I would like to let you know we're going to be sharing content with you via today's Zoom screen sharing feature. So we do encourage you to try to join us on the app. On the computer so you can see these great visuals that Larry and Wendy are going to be providing us today. We'd love for you to identify yourself. If you haven't already, would you please add your name to where it says, if you go to Manage Participants at the bottom, on the right-hand side, it will pop up with a me. If you hover over that, it'll show a rename, and we'd love for you to say who you are just so we know who's asking a question or making comments in the chat. Speaking of the chat button is accessible at the bottom of your window, and we'd love for you to use it during today's presentation to ask questions or make comments. Do note that for the most part, we're going to be holding questions during the presentation due to how many wonderful people are here on the call today, but we'd love to invite you to share those comments with us or questions in the chat, and we're going to be monitoring them until we get to the Q&A. And one last thing is that you are all going to be muted today. If you'd like to raise your hand on the app, you can press the raise the hand button, and on the phone to do so, you press *9 to raise your hand. And with all of that, I think we're done with housekeeping. We can get started with the webinar. So we are recording the event today, and we're going to be saving the chat and sending the video to all of you after we're done here today. If you have any questions about Zoom or anything not related to the webinar, feel welcome to message me directly or Rebecca or Courtney. We'd be happy to help you. So with all that aside, we're going to be hearing from two incredible civic engagement experts and some friends of mine, Wendy Willis and Larry Schooler. Wendy Willis is the Executive Director of the Deliberative Democracy Consortium, among many wonderful stripes to her name, as well as Larry Schooler, who is the Director of Consensus Building and Community Engagement at CD&P. And so with that, Wendy will be starting us off. The floor is yours.
Actually, I think, Larry, you're going to talk about the poll a little bit, right, first? Yeah, thanks.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
This era of our existence is nothing if not improvisatory and extemporaneous. So, welcome to our world. And I have to say, I'm really moved to be here today. I don't know the last time that I spoke in front of an audience this large, and I know that part of that has to do with the fact that folks are desperate to connect and find ways to learn during this extraordinary time in our nation's history, in our world's history. But I really want to thank you, first of all, for being with us today and for caring about the topic that I think consumes way more of Wendy's and my time than it probably should, but it's our life's work, our passion, and it's great to see so many people be interested in that. I wanted to just share with you all that this is only my third Zoom call today. So far, I am not totally addicted to Zoom, but I'm happy to be with you all and glad you could make it. Just wanted to share a couple of themes that I observed as I looked through your responses, and thank you all so much. We got upwards of 80 or more responses to that prompt about what's on top of mind. Certainly there's a lot of interest in understanding some of the offerings for online engagement, but there were just as many folks who expressed a desire to understand how to make engagement equitable, particularly for those for whom online access is either limited or non-existent. There were also folks wanting to know about how to manage large groups, how to break folks into smaller groups, how to reach perennially hard populations to reach, hosting interactive and meaningful virtual events, recovering a process that's already in flux, and trying to reflect an event that was planned for face-to-face in some sort of virtual setting. As I said to Wendy before we got on, phew, we're prepared to talk about just about all of that. So I think we'll have a good conversation here in the next little while, but please, if there are aspects of what we bring up that you'd like to hear more about, or if there are things that we just don't get to that you really would like to know about, that's what we're here for today. And we're so pleased to have everybody. And with that, I'll turn it over to Wendy Willis.
Great, thanks, Larry. And I'm so excited that you're all here. As I was looking at the participant list and then seeing you all pop up in the chat, I realized how much wisdom there is in the room with us, and recognizing that an hour is such a short amount of time to talk about such a big topic. So I'd like to consider this to be the beginning of a conversation rather than a definitive conversation. So thank you so much for coming. Like Larry, I'm both nervous because so many experts are here, and just super moved to really be together around this. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about just discerning when and whether engagement is appropriate, and in a really kind of blunt, quick way. And then Larry's going to talk about some of the tools that are available. And then at the end, we'll do a little mop-up on some additional considerations like the law, and making sure that, thinking about how to adapt your equity lens in this moment, given some of the inequities that are, obviously part of the backdrop of what we're all doing. So just to start with, just to remind ourselves, like, these are certainly extraordinary times. I know that at the very beginning of this, I had an urge to get back to normal as soon as possible. Like, we go home and we're working from home at least in my center, and I have an urge to do something. And I certainly, with the local governments that I work with here in Oregon, felt a similar urge from people, where they were talking about projects that pre-existed the pandemic. And so there was a lot of questions about, like, well, they became kind of technical questions. Technically, how do I engage people? So I think as we've come through this, realizing that there's technical questions, and then there are also emotional questions and practical questions and ethical questions, really, about when and where engagement is appropriate. And so just to kind of remind ourselves where we are, there's ongoing polling every week now as the pandemic progresses, and a Kaiser Family Fund poll that came out a couple weeks ago, and I think another one will come out this week, you know, large majorities of Americans say that the pandemic has disrupted their life, that they fear the healthcare system will be overrun, and that the worst is yet to come. So that's the backdrop of Americans' lives. And that 45%, 2 weeks ago now, 45% said that the pandemic and the aftermath has affected their mental health negatively. And I'm all certain that that's higher now. And some of the data really shows that in young people, particularly high school and college age, that those numbers are higher, even higher about mental health. You know, of course, 20% of Americans know someone who's tested positive. That's really different from community to community, both geographic and racial and economic communities. 80% of people worry about getting sick themselves. 80%, you know, large majorities say they're fearful about taking transit. One thing I wanted to just point out to you too, that ordinary activities now feel like a threat to people. So the things that we think of as, you know, day-to-day life, going to the grocery store, getting on the bus, and getting, and for people who are doing their jobs who can't work remotely, 60% of people who can't work remotely say that their job feels like a threat to them, to their health. 40% of Americans have lost a job or income. And of course, these impacts are asymmetric. So people's experience of the pandemic are really different. And so as you think about engagement, a kind of segmented way of thinking about engagement is really important here, because the asymmetry of resources is already unjust, and then to add this to it, the same vulnerable populations that are you know, are on the brink all the time anyway are definitely complicated by race, income, age, health, all the things that we know. We know that the pandemic is affecting people very differently and more severely depending on how vulnerable they are in other ways. And I also will point out, just there's a huge distinction in how people are confronted with this based on whether they have children in the home. So one of the things that I think, as we think about should we engage and when, is that people's ordinary lives are disrupted. So they're having to make decisions that ordinarily wouldn't be decisions, right? Should I go out? Should I go to the store? Should I wear a mask? Should I let my child go out? So all the questions that that ordinarily are sort of automatic are actually becoming decisions. And there's all sorts of data about whether or not people feel like they're getting sufficient guidance from government. And so when we typically think of engagement as the highest quality of engagement is putting people in the position where they're replicating the position of the decision maker and making trade-offs about policy and making trade-offs about values. And right now, one of the things we know is that people are making so many basic decisions that their capacity to engage in those trade-offs may be very compromised because of the you know, just the what day-to-day life looks like for folks. That said, we're seeing large town halls happening online in many communities. We know that trust in local government in particular has stayed steady. The last few weeks, trust in the federal government has dipped, you know, in double digits, and it has started to dip for states. But local governments, there's a steady trust and kind of a desire for information from local governments, particularly local health officials. And so people are showing up in some instances for large online town halls. The thing I will say about that, of course, is that the demographics of those town halls is not necessarily representative of the full community. So I would think this is the checklist that I'm using for myself when I'm talking with folks about whether or not now is the time to engage. Is it urgent? Is it important? Is it simple, or can it be simplified? Is it fair? And is it tone deaf? And so I think, you know, of course, everybody is having to do their own work, and governments need to make decisions. And some of them have to be made in short timelines. I know that we're working with local governments who are having to make decisions around some grants, they need to engage the public around, and so that that urgency requires them to participate. And so the question is, can you then simplify it sufficiently that you can get folks to that you could get input from the public in a way that's fair and simple, and doesn't feel like it's so outside what their day-to-day concerns are, that participation is appropriate. So I'm going to stop there on the discernment, because I know Larry has a lot about if one's going to go forward, how would we do it? How would we do it? So Larry, thanks everybody.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and I'm excited to pick up where Wendy left off. I was just chuckling to myself when Wendy said life is being disrupted, as my 5-year-old son just disrupted me to pick up his Legos. So forgive me if you heard a bit of rumbling and rustling in the background, but that is life in the age of COVID-19, and we are very fortunate just to have children that are, thank God, doing okay and healthy. Just want to make sure everybody can see my screen now. Is my slide visible?
Yes.
Okay, great. It was really interesting to me to hear Wendy's list of criteria for engagement, because I was trying to think about the best ways to align it with what has become kind of the guiding principle of, quite frankly, my life, not just my practice in public engagement, but my life, which is to say that those affected by a decision should be able to affect that decision. And I dare say that there are people on this call, mentors of mine, pioneers in the field of public engagement and participation, who probably coined that phrase, and I can't take any credit for it. I just say it very often. But I'm thinking about it a lot in this context because, as we well know, there are so many decisions that are being made that are affecting millions upon millions of people. And so I think as we think about some of the kinds of decisions and the ways in which those decisions are impacting the public and the way the public is getting to impact the decision, we're often on the sort of left-hand side of this spectrum, often called the inform end of the public participation spectrum, where the main goal is to keep the public informed about statistics related to COVID, ways to, take care of ourselves and so on. But we haven't seen nearly as much in the consult, involve, collaborate, and empower levels as you move from left to right. And one thing I've often talked about when I think about the IAP2 spectrum, which to me is a critical component to anyone's public engagement strategy, is that just as you move from left to right, you get increasing opportunities for the public to influence the decision leading up to maybe taking a binding vote. I would also argue that you can often think about how much the public should be engaged based on how much they are going to be impacted by the decision that's being made. Now, I'm not suggesting that we live in ancient Athens, Greece, and we can convene a ballot measure for all of the significant and sweeping measures that our elected officials and public administrators are taking. What I am suggesting is that we have to bear in mind that as urgent and as time sensitive as some of these decisions seem to be, we also are in an unparalleled age where the attention of the public, while certainly distracted by things like how am I going to make a living, how am I going to care for my children and whatnot, is in some ways also their attention might be even more available than it would be on a day-to-day basis. And it's not to say that it's undivided. I mean, clearly people have to continue working or continuing finding ways to provide and continuing to care for children and even elderly parents and so on. But I would contend that we have opportunities presented to us now in our field that we don't necessarily always have when people are rushing around, commuting to work, going to their school campuses for full days, just balancing all of the things that day-to-day life typically throws our way, and that perhaps we have opportunities now to connect with people and hear from them that we didn't before. I also, like Wendy, have been watching some of the statistical data coming in from polls. Bloomberg put out a survey to mayors across the country, and I found it very interesting that among their top challenges were communicating reliable information and planning for long-term community needs, which is to say that there's what needs to happen on a day-to-day basis that they're worried about, but they're also concerned about making sure that the further reaching impacts of this pandemic they can prepare for. And then Public Agenda recently worked with a couple of other organizations on a national survey and found some remarkable things about folks connecting with their neighbors and their communities in ways that are different, calling more than texting, for example, and also expressing shared values around the ways they actually want to see their decision makers reopen the country, so to speak, or rebooting the economy. And I mention this not to make any sort of political statement, but simply to raise the question, how do we connect those significant decision makers, be they mayors, governors, the president, and so on, to the opinions and the perspectives of those who are going to be most dramatically impacted, because it's clear that they have strongly held opinions about how things should go just in managing this particular crisis. There's a remarkable survey also recently conducted by Hill and Knowlton, a communications firm that was focused on the Canadian population, and I found it very interesting that they were interested. They felt it was even more important for them to be engaged by all levels of government now, and you'll notice this poll was taken at the end of March when the pandemic was already kind of upon us, that it's more important for that engagement to occur now even than before. And so that gets to why it might be we would engage, and forgive me for going a little quickly, but I am mindful of making sure that we cover as much rich content as we can. I think we have to acknowledge that whether our mental energy is totally focused on COVID-19 and recovering from the pandemic or not, there are still going to be legal mandates associated with the approval of budgets or the approval of other kinds of statutory measures and regulatory measures at all levels of government that will continue regardless of what else is happening in the world. And so we need to make sure that we are meeting some legal mandates. We also want to make sure that we're really getting a broad sense of the public interest, not simply the what I call super citizens, what others call usual suspects. We certainly need and want to hear from them, but we need to make sure that with actions that are going to have such of a sweeping impact, we're getting a broad spectrum of opinions. We may also want to engage in order to generate some new solutions. We've certainly seen lots of coverage of shortages of supplies and remarkable ways that, for example, vodka distilleries are pitching in when it comes to hand sanitizer, or others are manufacturing masks that are desperately needed. And so there could be ways for us to get out of some of the crises of the moment that we would only know if we thoughtfully engaged the public. We also, of course, need to share information, and never perhaps has that been more critical. We could also have a situation, and I think we do, where there are interests in conflict, where there are those who think, for example, that business should return to some sort of usual or normal with all deliberate speed, and others who are advising much greater caution. And so I think it's important for us to assemble the public in the ways that we can in order to get to a consensus place on that. We also need to be cognizant of avoiding a negative outcome. Interestingly, there was an article just in today's New York Times that referenced a Trump administration proposed rule change that was blocked by the courts exclusively on the basis of the fact that it had not allowed for public comment. In other words, they had tried to make a change to some nutrition-based rule and had changed it so significantly that it should have had public comment. And because they didn't, they were sued and the measure was blocked. And so I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that even in this extraordinary time, there could still be significant measures taken to block needed governmental action, and we have to be prepared for that. It's also important to think about ways in which engagement can help build support for some of the difficult decisions that we're going to make. It's very unpopular among some sectors of the population to do some of the things that we're doing during COVID-19. But the more people feel like they are part of the solution, the more they think, as we used to say in workplaces, you know, making the boss think that it's her or his idea. Of course, the public is the boss of the elected establishment. And so the more that we can involve them in that conversation, perhaps the more they're willing to support stuff that's hard to stomach. And of course, there's the notion of building relationships, social capital, and trust, as Wendy mentioned before, seemingly on the rise, at least at the local level. So then we get to the notion that a lot of you talked about in your survey responses, which is, okay, we need to engage and we can't gather people together. How do we do that? And I think a lot of people reach for the internet. And This graphic comes from the Pew Research Center, and I don't think this will surprise many people, but what we find, as you can see, is that internet use has certainly become very ubiquitous in certain segments of the population. You see young adults with a really striking level of internet access, but then as you get to older populations and as you get to lower income populations, that access declines, and also in rural populations. I was having a conversation yesterday with someone who told me that across the region that she works in, 20 to 30% of all students are able to participate in online lessons. And that's even in cases where internet is being given away for free and laptops are being rented out. There just are a lot of obstacles to internet usage that I think all of us who are on this internet platform, I know some are called in, but a lot of us on this internet platform are probably taking for granted. In addition, as we see, just an expansion of the earlier graph, there are large percentages, as you can see, folks that have less than a high school diploma are significantly disconnected, as are people of lower incomes and in rural communities and so forth. And then we see that even if people have internet access, quite a large percentage view the smartphone as their primary means. And so we have to think about what that could mean in terms of creating a virtual experience, because obviously what I can see on my laptop and interact with on my laptop is very different than what I can do on my smartphone. And so we need to consider ways that we can adapt to a potential online solution that someone might only access from a very small screen. Putting all of that aside for a moment, I think it's extremely critical to consider what I'm going to call offline technology, which is to say technology that is not solely dependent on internet access. It is probably not a surprise to you all that nearly every single municipality, county, school district, state legislature in the country has access to a television station, and most of them stream that content on the web that they're not fully utilizing. A lot of them put those official meetings on the air, and that's the extent of their original programming. They might replay some programming from elsewhere, but they're not utilizing their television station as a tool for engaging with the community. And it's a tool not only that all governments have access to, but nearly all homes with a television that's connected have access to as well. And then in addition to that, text messaging, which is something that I'm sure a lot of us take for granted, has become incredibly ubiquitous and not simply available to everyone, but something that they actually use on a regular basis and are more likely to open messages from than even from an email. This finding here was pretty remarkable to me, the opening rate of a text versus an email. And so now we have to kind of look back at our sort of our menu, our toolkit of engagement tools, and think, well, how are we going to kind of convert some of these tools into our new era? In a moment, I'm going to talk a little bit about official meetings, whether it be council meetings, county commission meetings, school board meetings, planning board, planning commission type meetings, meetings with constituents. I also want to cover some of the more innovative work that's been done in the last, I would say, 30 years or so. Certainly it's picked up more momentum in the last 20 to 10 around more interactive face-to-face workshops, or popping up in popular community hotspots, or mobilizing a group of, say, 10 to 20 people to work on a topic across a broad cross-section of interests over a long period of time. And then I'm going to talk also about the notion of volunteer facilitators. And then I want to get to some of these remote and virtual tools. And you'll notice that some of what I've listed under remote and virtual is not very high tech. We're talking about things like the newspaper or a paper survey that might get distributed. And then, of course, some of the other tools there do involve some form of technology. But we cannot, and I repeat, we cannot assume that any member of our community has a requisite amount of technological access. And even if they actually have the access, that doesn't mean they're equipped to use it for the kind of purposes that we have. One of the projects that I was involved in when I worked in the city of Austin government was the notion of building a conversation corps, CORPS. And the idea here was that we trained over 150 community volunteers to then take discussion guides out into the community, either to an established organization or just to a hotspot like a cafe, And they conducted those conversations on behalf of the city, the transit agency, and the school board. And I think that as so many people during COVID-19 look for a way to give back and to be part of a solution, it could be really interesting to build a conversation core of folks who can help get messages out, as well as collect input from their various peer groups, communities, book clubs, other people that they're close with and can be more likely able to connect with. And then I want to get to this notion of continuing sort of regular meetings of government. So my company has been given the honor and the task of working with a couple of different clients, a county commissioner's court and a municipal government, to facilitate people being able to speak during city council and county commission, even in this extraordinary era. Now, I've seen this be done a lot of different ways across the country, including some who are given the sort of Zoom link that the city council members have themselves, and you can only, I'm sure, imagine what some of the risks are associated with that. I've also seen a lot of communities build in a registration online, and it's obvious what some of the limiting factors there can be. For folks that don't have internet access, how might they register? And if you don't hear about the registration, you might be out of luck. So what we've done is create a toll-free line and then deployed ourselves as screeners and hosts and bridge that to whatever it is that the elected officials are on, and be able to connect that to whatever the telecast or web stream of the meeting might be. We screen callers and then provide the on-screen labels so we can see what it is that we have on the line, and then we announce to client a new caller, and then we unmute and take that on the air. So I'm going to stop my slideshow here for just a second to try to share with you a sample of what this looks like in real time.
Judge Eckert, this is Larry Schooler. I don't mean to interrupt, but we do have someone standing by to speak on this item whenever it's convenient.
Great. Thank you so much, Larry. That's not an interruption at all. Thank you for notifying us. So with that, why don't we go to the caller?
So we're standing by with Ms. Zenobia Joseph, and she should be unmuted and ready to speak. If you can hear us, please go ahead.
Hello, Ms. Joseph.
Hi, Judge. Thank you, Commissioners. I'm Zenobia Joseph. My comments specifically are related to COVID-19, the orders, and you don't have number 3 up there on the screen. So I'm not sure if you wanted me to make that comment now or not.
There, just in the interest of time. But I want to point a couple of things out to you. One is that just prior to Ms. Joseph's calling, there were 3 what I'll call prank callers who dialed into the meeting. And so if anything was evidence of the need for some sort of screening, it's that experience. And you might say that the pre-registration on the web could alleviate that. But again, you're expecting people in this extraordinarily frenzied time to know to do both the web registration and the call in at the right time and so forth. And so I would argue that the more we can lower the barriers to entry to that form of participation, the better off that we're going to be. So let me go back to the slide deck here for just a second. I just wanted to share this interesting graphic that was done by the city of Lakewood, Colorado, which has done a tremendous amount even up to now, prior to COVID-19, with the allowing people to comment remotely. And you'll notice that when it comes to in-person participation, their numbers skewed much older than with online participation. And so I think it's not just a matter of catering to a COVID-19 limited population, it's also something that should be thought about as permanent civic infrastructure, if you will. So beyond just allowing for folks to call into existing meetings, we've also invested a lot of time and energy in what we're calling either televised town halls or televised community conversations. And these are events where people can call in, text in, or use the web to tweet in or post. And we also provide a line in Spanish that allows people to give their comments in Spanish and then have them translated and have them read out to me in English. So I'm going to show you a very brief clip from one of our experiments with this now.
Phone.
All right, well, the other critical question before we get into listener comments and questions is coming up here in just a moment, and that relates to the trade-off that in order to get this more frequent service, the customer, the user, would have to pay that additional rate that Bob talked about. So would you support the expansion in recycling service to weekly if the City of Austin charged around $3 more on each monthly utility bill? Again, would you support going from every other week pickup of recycling to weekly if the city charged an additional $3 per month per user for that service? And again, based on the comments we heard a little while ago, that's not an opt-in kind of service. That would have to be something borne by all of the folks in our system. So if your choice would be yes, I'd accept that, then you'd text that A to 22333. No would be B. C would be unsure. And you can also tweet that at austintexas.gov. Interesting, gentlemen, if I look at the phone results, there is a higher percentage now saying no, I would not want to pay the additional charge for that service. Not necessarily all that surprising. It's hard to accept higher rates for anything. 30% though on the phone say they are in favor of expanding the service, and about 8% right now are saying that they're unsure. So on the phone we're seeing a discrepancy in favor of those not willing to pay that extra $3. In a moment we'll see some results from texting and from Twitter that'll show us what they're saying. And as you can see,
you'll notice that we leveraged Poll Everywhere here, just as we did for this webinar. And what I really want to emphasize is whether it's Poll Everywhere, there's another platform called Mentimeter that might interest some folks. These platforms obviously can be used without regard to how close someone is sitting to my computer or to the site of the meeting. They're of course in the cloud. And so we're able to enable people to text in their responses and produce them in real time, even if they're watching us from 40 miles away. And we were told by Poll Everywhere, who wrote about this, that it was one of the first times they had seen it after seen it being used in this particular fashion. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So I know I've spent a lot of time here. I'm going to try to get through just a few last pieces here and then pass it back to Wendy. So, I mean, this just illustrates for you the fact that, you know, any sort of typical face-to-face meeting, even if we were doing all that we possibly could, would probably only get us a few hundred folks. And this kind of experience, which was widely accessible to virtually anybody, was really pretty widely embraced. And I remember several older participants who thanked us for giving them the opportunity to participate just by sitting in their living room. And I remember a friend of mine who lived across the street and also had young kids tweeting, just gave the kids a bath in one phone and listening to Larry's voice in my other hand. And, you know, I think that we have to acknowledge that hard to reach populations aren't just the stereotypical ones. They're all of us can be hard to reach at any given time. This just gives you a feel for how I've thought about some of these televised community conversations. It's important to build in as much interactivity as you possibly can, to have a way for subject matter experts to participate, but also frequent opportunities for the public to weigh in. And we were able to use a call queue with the particular platform that we had on this one that made it a lot easier for us to manage callers who joined in. So I just talked about Poll Everywhere and Mentimeter. I won't spend much time on that slide. I do, though, also want to mention a platform called Text Talk Act, which some of you may be very familiar with, because there are ways to leverage text messaging that don't require people to be on the line or texting at the one particular place and time. And this can be used to kind of seed a conversation that a small group is having or even a single person is having. So you opt in, you get a question, you respond, you get another question, and it could be done in such a way that you can branch into different parts of the conversation. So I highly recommend that. I think maybe some of the Text Talk Act folks are even on this line. And then there's something even simpler. You know, Twitter is lampooned a lot in popular culture because of how much ridiculousness we tend to see and how much vitriol. But I have witnessed firsthand its use in a crisis. This screenshot comes from a tragic event that took place in Austin during South by Southwest, where someone was able to tweet at the police to give a statement, which was fairly remarkable. And then during flooding in Austin, someone was able to tweet their address directly to public safety. And so I just want to encourage you to be thinking, what is the consistent hashtag that we can use in our community or for our clients that will enable people to easily post information or get information from us on a medium that is clearly widely subscribed. So now I just want to touch upon some of the ways that we can take our workshops and make them interactive. This was tricky for me to do. The picture on the screen is one of a face-to-face workshop we did on our bond referendum. And as you can see, we had small group breakouts. We had sort of an open house style display for people to get more information. And so I really grappled with the right way to talk about all of the different platforms that are available out there. I've listed a few on the screen that I think are particularly well suited to taking an event like this and converting it into a virtual space. But I do want to emphasize that while they are all fantastic, and I consider them all to be, pioneers in the civic technology space, they of course in most cases depend on internet access. But I highly recommend these pages. I think that they each have different levels of functionality, and so I think it's important to know what are you actually trying to accomplish? Is it an open house where you let people self-select the subtopic that they want to talk about? Is it one set of questions you want everybody to answer? Do you want people to break out into small groups? And if so, do you have a facilitator who can plug into that? Do you have either a volunteer or a staff person who can be part of that breakout on something like Zoom or teleconference to help that conversation stay on track? Again, these are some of the other platforms that I find to be particularly powerful and can be leveraged as an element of the approach that you're going to take. And I just want to also highlight one of them in particular, Balancing Act, because I think that one of the key aspects of this crisis is this notion of dealing with very, very difficult spending choices. And Balancing Act is one of a number of sites, but has really invested a lot in both a way for someone to go on at any time and try to figure out spending priorities, but also to do it in the context of a public meeting. So I do recommend that one in particular, just given some of the unique challenges of our time. So it's really all about a balanced and blended strategy, redefining public meeting or town hall to be as interactive as possible, with as many ways for the public to share their opinion as possible, really looking for either completely tech-free solutions or ones that rely on nothing more than a phone or a television set or just something very, very rudimentary and basic. And then perhaps leveraging the innovation that I described on the last slide for a even wider and deeper reach when the circumstances call for that. But again, I think that it's incredibly important in the times that we're living in to make sure that our strategy is keeping everybody under our tent for maximum engagement. I'm going to go back to Wendy now. Sorry, Wendy, to take so much time.
No, that was great. I learned a lot. Thanks, Larry. I'm gonna quickly go through just a couple of sort of I would call it troubleshooting slides before we open this up for questions, because I think that's a really important thing to do here. So of course we've talked about an equity lens, and and Larry talked about many of those things, and I was watching the comments, and of course there's obviously the deep divisions and inequities in our culture are revealing themselves even more extremely here. And of course, the digital divide, reading level, language, mistrust of government. I saw someone mention on the chat color blindness, which I have to admit that I had not thought of. So those are all very helpful. And of course, some of these things, an online environment can be very helpful for closed captioning, using digital interpretation that may not be perfect, but it can happen quite quickly and can happen in multiple languages. And then there's all sorts of interesting things happening around the country right now using volunteers. Even if I read a story about a Zoom town hall that happened that was very important, that older adults were involved. And so volunteers were actually calling older adults on the phone and connecting them to Zoom through through the telephone. So volunteers can be deployed in so many ways. And I think this is a really good example of why our civic engagement infrastructure needs to be built before we're in a crisis, because then we can sort of start to thread through and tap into our to the folks that we already know, hopefully. There's a couple thoughts that I wanted to mention that sort of connect back to Larry's work. And one is that if there is a core, like at Oregon's Kitchen Table, we actually have a core of culturally specific organizers and language group organizers, and we can tap into those folks at any point. And of course, that group of people are very connected to where particular communities are working and supporting one another and building social capital right now. And one of the big places that's happening in Oregon, at least in language groups, is radio. And sometimes radio stations that have really, really small and specific listenership. And we're encouraging some of our government partners to actually go on those radio stations and just answer questions, on the fly on a Spanish radio station and some of the tribal radio stations where and it doesn't require anyone to really move. It will require, oftentimes will require some translation, but it's a easy place to get access. The other place that is a relatively easy place to get access is things like utility bills, where you can send very simple surveys through utility bills that can either be mailed back or that can come back with the bill. So thinking through the places that have deep penetration that may not be internet based. I want to give time for questions, but I want to say one of our most valuable partners is a plain language translator who we work with on every piece of material that we ever use, even before this crisis, but a plain language translator is a very important resource at the moment. So let me quickly just I want to just talk about the legal stuff very briefly. And I think to think about whether or not, if you're working, and then I know that there's folks from Canada and other places on the line, so just forgive me for a minute to just talk about this in the American context because I don't know the other context, but to think through, is there authority to hold an official digital meeting and to know that about yourself? And often that pops up in their quorum requirement, and that the quorum requirement may or may not allow people to appear, the elected officials to appear digitally. So think about that. Obviously, we've talked a lot about notice and comment, so we can I'll skip past that. But also to think through whether or not this is an opportunity to actually change your statutory requirements right now to deal with the crisis, that it actually might expand the possibilities for other types of engagement in the future. And then, of course, quickly, we've talked about Zoom bombing. Larry talked about that well. I'm just feeling conscious of the time. There's been some public meetings in Oregon where people are being sort of kicked off the meetings for just what they're calling disruptive behavior, and some of it is they're not constituents. It's people who are just trying to disrupt, but there are people who are actually being kicked off who claim, at least, that they felt really unclear about what the expectations were, like what is disruptive, how the meeting is going to proceed. So just being super, super clear on what the culture of the meeting is, and then having sufficient staffing to work with people to make sure that they stay within the bounds. Because just as you can't just remove people from in-person meetings, there may be constitutional prohibitions on removing people who we think of as disruptive from a digital meeting as well. So I know I kind of zipped through that, but I wanted to just get that material out there so that we can now move on to questions.
And I just wanted to add real quickly that what Wendy just spoke of in terms of kind of what may or may not kick somebody off the line is something we've talked about with the clients we're supporting on these public meetings, because it's tricky. I mean, obviously, if I'm facilitating in a face-to-face setting, I've talked with the client ahead of time about kind of what license I have to interject and discussion agreements that I want to use and agenda that I want to use and so forth. And in the case of the public meetings we're supporting now, there are rare instances in my experience where someone is halted from speaking for anything other than time limit in a face-to-face setting. And so, we make sure that we've spoken to the client at the beginning to say, what are the guidelines here? Do you want us to be the ones to, shut off someone's connection if they do X, Y, and Z? Do you want to do that? How should that look? And I think that's really an important consideration.
Great. Thank you, Wendy and Larry, for all of that information. We do have a number of questions, so I'm going to just read off some of the questions that have gone through the chat. We have tried to pull out all of them, but if I don't get to yours, please feel free to re-enter it into the chat and or raise your hand through the app or by pressing *9 on your phone. So I'm going to start with the first one that I saw come through. What tools do you use to identify internet access in specific zip codes besides contacting the internet provider?
That's a good question. I don't know that I've ever been asked to do that. I've certainly benefited from university research. For example, at the University of Texas, I know they had done pretty good analysis of where internet connectivity was highest and or where there might be community hotspots or community access available at a public place. I don't know that I have a sort of single go-to when it comes to that. That would probably be a fairly localized experiment for me, but I do also rely upon some of the generalized data to tell me, well, demographically speaking, here's some pockets where internet usage is likely to be quite low, and so let me think through if I know that about a particular area or a type of person, type of background, then I'm going to really work hard on non-internet-based solutions.
And for us, we tend to, we do share a floor with the Population Research Center for Oregon, so oftentimes we can get sort of back-channeled information on zip codes, and if your state has a Population Research Center, oftentimes they know that kind of thing. The other, how we really approach that issue is we work with organizers from culturally specific organizations and communities and just talk about not just true internet access, but culture around internet use. Like how does your community use the internet or not, and what would be appropriate? So oftentimes it's very deeply relational and conversation based.
Great, thank you guys both for that. And then there's a question about the tool WhatsApp, and if anyone had experimented with that for interactive gatherings and trainings. It was noted that some low resource countries are using that with some success.
I don't know that I've deployed it in a specifically work setting. I'm smiling just because my kids' school, one of them uses it to a tremendous effect. I mean, I feel like I get a WhatsApp every half an hour from one of our kids' schools. I think for those who aren't as familiar, it seems to be, essentially free, other than the internet access that you need in order to get a WhatsApp message. But it's not like a text message where you need a plan or so forth. And so I don't know that I've used it particularly in a public engagement context. I could see it being useful as a way to put together some small group conversation. That might be very interesting if you're trying to connect people for whom that's kind of the best way to get to them. And I do know WhatsApp is very popular, not just in the States, but around the world for people that have kind of limited technological access, but they do have a mobile, maybe with some internet. I can't say though that I can have any, speak from any experience in terms of deploying it for public engagement.
Me either, yeah.
Okay, great. And then I just wanted to point out a couple of comments from the chat to follow up on the internet access question. Catherine mentioned that U.S. Census collects data related to internet access by zip code, so you should be able to find that. And then a friend from the UK mentioned that the UK National Statistics Agency collects similar information. All right, moving on to the next question. Larry, this one was for you. They wanted to see if you could say more about how you trained the 150 community volunteers to facilitate online.
Yeah, it's a good question. I saw that come across, and the training that we conducted for Conversation Corps thus far has been done in a face-to-face setting. I will say that I did a training for a national infrastructure firm on conflict resolution and facilitation, and I did it here on Zoom, and I combined a traditional presentation with a lot of poll questions and back and forth, and then I broke the group out into small breakout groups and had them prepare sort of a role play of a facilitation of a public meeting or a stakeholder interaction. And what was interesting was they were from all different offices around the country, so a group of 4 might be from 4 different places, like we're all dealing with now. And so I was able to then bring them back into the main session and have each group kind of take their turn at role play and give us some feedback, and get some feedback, I should say. And so I think it's very much doable, and I think it really just depends on thinking through the resources that you would use to deliver that training in person, and then, you know, tailoring it to the particular platform that you might use. And, you know, I'm sure that others would say this better than I, but, you know, Zoom is one of about, you know, a dozen or more platforms of its type, and it's beneficial for a lot of things, and I think it's proved its value here in the last few weeks, more so than maybe ever before. But I think it's very important to really scrutinize all of the different ways that a video conferencing platform can be used. And in particular, if you're trying to train community volunteers, can you create ways for them to connect by phone? And most of the platforms do allow for that. But can you connect by phone? Can you know, branch out into a small group, even if you're just on the phone? I think that's extremely important. But some of the tools have whiteboards and other ways that you can augment your teaching that some tools don't.
Great. Moving on to the next question, someone wants to know if anyone knows of strategies that replace traditional neighborhood canvassing. I think, Wendy, you might have touched on this a little bit by mention of the utility bill and putting inserts into that. Any other thoughts on that?
Rebecca, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yes, someone asked if there were any alternatives to traditional neighborhood canvassing.
Well, I mean, I actually think the answer to that is no. I mean, I think we should not say to ourselves we're ever going to substitute sort of traditional organizing techniques in life, but I think in extraordinary circumstances to think through who is connected to particular networks and how they are connecting, and then to tap into those. But that's a really relational strategy that sort of, as anyone, the person who asked about neighborhood canvassing obviously is an organizer or has been an organizer, because that's such a, such a traditional, and I think irreplaceable type of activity. But I know that working through, like, how are landlords communicating with tenants, how are churches communicating with congregants, how are neighborhoods communicating with one another, like, how is that happening organically?
Yeah.
And then tapping into those relationships. And I think, one of the places that I know that's happening, at least in my communities, are through Facebook groups, like through super specific Facebook groups, like mothers of toddlers level specific Facebook groups, or cooking Facebook groups. So to really, but that takes, of course, having those relationships and developing those relationships. But I think kind of thinking about that as a long-term strategy is really important.
Yeah, and I just would add to that by saying that we need to bear in mind that in the midst of this tremendous, maelstrom of information and conflicting information, a lot of people are not going to turn where you think they're going to turn. They may not turn to local government. They may not turn to state and federal government. They may turn to, as Wendy said, their church. They may turn to their business association. They may turn to their homeowners association. And so having as thorough a map of the organizations that cover wherever you're trying to reach and really connecting with the public through them, I think is mission critical in any project, but certainly now.
And to not to be like, I know you all know this, but just to remind ourselves that these are not transactions, that they're relationships. And so to continue to, that this is it's a long-term process, and that it's just to drop in on people and then never to be seen again is not a practice that's gonna benefit anybody.
Great, and I know we are running out of time here, but Wendy and Larry, if you're
Keep 'em
available
coming.
to
Keep 'em
stay
coming.
on, I figured I'd go ahead and continue sending these until
And please do.
people get tired of us.
Or
Okay.
until my 5-year-old son jumps on my back, whichever comes first.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
So there was one question if there had been a tech solution to the 3 minutes at the mic limitation. So they're wondering if there's a platform that has figured out how to post like a countdown timer.
Well, I can't be sure of my answer to that question, but I do want to sort of do a special call out to a couple of particular platforms that I think are doing some interesting things in the sort of specifically public meeting space. One of which is public input that I mentioned. Another is this, I think it's called People Speak that I mentioned on the Colorado slide with the pie charts of, you know, different kinds of participation online versus in person. There's also a site called e-comment where people can actually make their comments there rather than waiting to have a turn to speak. So I would think that both of those platforms, as well as a couple of others, would have that kind of built-in component to it. I can't say that I've personally utilized it to tell you for sure, but I would recommend folks seeking out not just an engagement platform for that sort of thing, but something that really is thinking through the niche of supporting a public meeting and integrating different, you know, streams and bridges and so forth into that same meeting.
And I would suggest, I think radio also has a lot to offer in terms of screening and count.
Okay, great. And then another question was in regards to if there's a way to ensure that someone is a constituent or not, since people won't necessarily be calling in by area code.
Yeah, I'm always I shouldn't say amazed by the question, but I'm always really struck by this question because I certainly have worked in areas where you cannot limit the impact of a particular policy decision to people who live in that jurisdiction. For example, we were working on a plastic and paper bag ordinance years ago in Austin. The people who make the bags aren't in Austin. The people who shop and get the bags from their grocery store don't always live in Austin and vote for Austin elected officials. But that doesn't really mean that they aren't stakeholders. Having said all of that, obviously I'm sure everybody is familiar with Nextdoor, and I think that Nextdoor's big advantage is that it has various well-tested methods to verify someone's actual residence. And while there are certainly limits as to how a convener of dialogue can use those can use Nextdoor to get the word out. A lot of public agencies can use Nextdoor to reach their entire community, all of the neighborhoods that are set up on that platform. And I think also there's a platform run by a colleague in Canada called, I believe it's Place Speak, which does some verification. And then I know Polco, P-O-L-C-O, checks voter registration data as it incorporates comments. So that's there, but again, I would caution against, you know, doing some sort of artificial limitation on who participates, because I really do think that a lot of our decisions know no boundaries, and it's more important just to know as much about the person as we can, but not make that a limiting factor as to whether they participate.
Well, I see Becky's clarified the question a little bit in the chat about, like, I think Larry, all those resources he offered were great. I think, you know, I think this idea about outside interference is a really interesting question, and one that is also relevant outside of this crisis. And one of the things that some of the screening techniques where you're using volunteers to actually engage with the person before they make comments, either digitally or on the phone, I think you can screen out people who are just, you know, pure troublemakers, or at least minimize outside agitators.
Great, thanks for that clarification. Now we have a couple of questions in regards to additional information about that, about this topic. One question specifically is there a more in-depth training that you would recommend on this information?
That's a great question, and I will selfishly and somewhat self-servingly say that Wendy and I were talking about that very thing, that we would like to work on together. Certainly you can, when the time is right, and to the extent that it's being delivered either online or in person, seek out the International Association for Public Participation. Their training is superb, and it's, in my opinion, the kind of the foundation for just about anybody that wants to do any of this work. There are lots of more in-depth ways to go about it. There's facilitation training, which I do a lot of, but that's offered, for 1 day or 5 days. There is training that's more specific to the technology side of things. I guess what I would say in this day and age is, certainly seek Wendy and I out if there are things that you and your colleagues would like to be trained on, because it's just so hard to know at this particular moment, who's doing what kind of training and whether they're truly ready to deliver it online. So I say that not to be too self-serving of Wendy and myself, but truly I don't know right now what the position is for a lot of training providers when it comes to delivering their content online. But I certainly, believe IAP2 and NCDD, but IAP2 has kind of got the corner on some of the basic training, I think, that the questioner might be after.
Just to follow up on that, I agree with absolutely everything Larry just said, but I also think that we're sort of teaching, our human organism says, this is our new normal, and this is how it's going to be forever. And so to try to pull ourselves out of the thinking about, like, what do we need to be trained for today, tomorrow, the next day, but also, what's the future look like? So I'm really curious about thinking how to train ourselves up for what we want the future of our relationship amongst ourselves to be.
And I just want to say also that it's important. I've been exposed to a lot of different forms of training, face-to-face, online, and I've delivered a lot of it. And when it comes to delivering training that's not face-to-face, there's not a one-size-fits-all, meaning that it doesn't have to be, we'll get on the Zoom, we'll have a live session for however long, we'll then break out, then we'll come back together. There could be a tremendous amount of content delivered, again, sort of asynchronously, in such a way that people kind of digest the material at their own pace, and then perhaps join a live session to test out some of the tactics and techniques. But I think we have to acknowledge that given all of the pressures that are coming to bear on us and our families, asking someone to sit still for the typical 3 or 4 day or even full day training course in a Zoom context or some other similar context is potentially unrealistic. And so thinking through different ways to deliver the same content and value, I think, is important at this time.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I also wanted to offer one of the things that we had talked about briefly with the presenters was that if, there seemed to be a huge interest in this through the call, that we could potentially look into doing like a smaller Zoom sessions with maybe breakout groups and that sort of thing. If people are interested in that, we'll have a post-webinar survey, and I'll add a question in there about if people would be interested in additional information and maybe coming together as a group to address some of those things that we didn't quite get to today. But with that, I do think we'll need to wrap up. On your screen, you're going to see all of our contact information. Please feel free to reach out to both Wendy or Larry if you have any questions about any of the content that they shared with us today. And then also Kiva for any questions about NCDD. And then you can reach out to me with any questions about the National Civic League or the All-America City Awards. Again, we will be sending out a recording, slides, a copy of the chat, and a post-event survey. So please be on the lookout. Thank you all again so much for taking your time to be here with us today. Special thank you to Wendy and Larry for taking time out of your busy schedules. We really appreciate everyone coming together and helping us all support each other as we get through this interesting time.
And big thanks to Kiva and Rebecca and the Civic League and NCDD for bringing us all together, making this happen. And thanks to Wendy. It's great to present with you.
Yeah, it was great to be with all of you. And it makes me be able to go to sleep at night thinking about all the great work that you're all doing out there. So thank you for doing it, and thanks Kiva and Rebecca and the whole team at both of your organizations.
Well
Take care,
said.
everybody.
Thank you so
Stay
much,
safe and
Wendy.
stay healthy.
Thank you, Larry. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everybody.